Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast. We, of course, are here with you every week, and indeed sometimes more than that, actually, to bring you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, but more importantly, here is Alex Salmond's former Chief of Staff, Geoff Aberdein. Hello, Geoff.
Hello.
Hi, and I would normally introduce Andy at this point, but he's running late, so he'll join us in a few minutes. The reason we're cracking on is because we've got a couple of special guests with us for lots of, well, quite interesting, progressive, and I mean moving on, a particular conversation around independence and other things as well, it's worth saying. So welcome to the podcast, former Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale. Hello, Kezia.
Hello, lovely to see you all.
It's great to have you here. And also former SNP strategist and indeed former chief strategist for Yes Scotland, Stephen Noon. Hello, Stephen.
Hello there.
Very good to have you both on, and intriguing to have you both on, but more of that to come, because Luke, who's joined us, it's Andy Maciver, former Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Geoff Aberdein. Listeners won't see, but Geoff Aberdein shaking his head, but I'm late because he made me bring the thing forward, so I'm not going to take any shaking of the head from Geoffrey.
I mean, what we'd
Forget it.
on the radio, we'd refer to this as an off-air conversation, Andy. So we'll do that off the pod. Just before we crack on with Kezia and Stephen, and indeed Andy, Geoff, I wanted to ask you about your trip to Brewdog in Aberdein at the weekend, which you texted us about.
Oh, yes. Now, very quickly. I can't remember the guy's name. Did I text you?
Liam Ewan is his name.
Liam Ewan. So I was at the Spartans game. Now, the Aberdeen were playing Spartans League Cup. We won 4-0. I used to play for Spartans back in the day. And so we had a bunch of mates up. And safe to say, the beers were flowing. And we were in Brewdog. And I was opining about something. And a guy came up to me and said, I recognise the voice. You're on Holyrood Sources podcast. And that is my first brush with celebrity on the back of Holyrood Sources. Lovely guy, speaking to his girlfriend or wife. I did speak to him for a while. I think he realised very quickly that I was maybe, a few on. But I did say I would give him a shout out. He does a remarkable job at North East Scotland College on various skills initiatives. So thank you, Liam, and keep listening.
Yeah, indeed. Hello, Liam. It's worth saying we probably wouldn't have told that story if Aberdeen hadn't won. I think that was actually the key detail in all of that. Right, so the reason we've got Kezia and Stephen with us today is because they have put forward a new proposition on political conversation and on the direction, I suppose, of politics in Scotland. It's published in a new paper today. We're recording... Well... It's published in a new paper on Wednesday when you're listening to this, so you can get access to the full thing. Before we get on to their paper, though, I want to just start with a couple of kind of events of the week, as we always do on the podcast. And let's start with the Labour Party conference, shall we? Labour went into this conference with a 174-seat majority. They won that, of course, a little more than 2 months ago. But everything comes at a cost, it would seem, apart from Sir Keir Starmer's clothes and glasses, tickets to Taylor Swift for the Education Secretary, and a box at, well, whatever football match you fancy going to. We'll touch on all of that. Andy, we're saying all of this because their victory was huge, but the honeymoon may, in fact, be over.
I don't think the honeymoon is over, actually. I think a lot of this goes back to the campaign. I think it was a very negative campaign. I understand why it was negative, because effectively the way to win this election was to just not be the Tories. I get that. And they did pretty well on the back of that. Massive majority, quite a small vote share actually, but a massive majority. And it worked for them. I would probably have liked to see Sir Keir Starmer be a bit more strategic and to sacrifice a bit of that majority, but claim a bigger mandate for positive, optimistic change. That's what Blair did. Blair wasn't elected just because he wasn't the Tories. He was elected because he was Blair. And I don't think you can say the same for Starmer. And I think that sort of negativity, I think the lack of content, the lack of things to say has bled into what has been happening over the last week or so. I'm not saying the campaign's to blame for season tickets at the Emirates. I'm not linking those two things necessarily, but I think the campaign is to blame for the general negativity that has been lingering around what is supposed to be a positive new government. The reason I don't think the honeymoon is over is that I think they can, and I think you've heard Rachel Reeves over the last couple of days trying to change the narrative a little bit and change the tone, and I do think they can do that. It's inevitable in the moment when this sort of thing is happening to think there's a disaster, this means inevitably that X is the case. I don't think that will be the case. I think in a few weeks' time it will be largely forgotten about, and I think they still have plenty time to move on to a more positive footing. The election's not for almost 5 years, so I think they will be okay.
I take that. I suppose the kind of freebies pile on to winter fuel payment, pile on to the two-child cap, and pile on to polling. Ipsos polling conducted between August the 9th and 12th showed that actually Sir Keir Starmer's favourability is down. 22% say they think things in Britain are heading in the right direction. 52% think it's going in the wrong direction. Geoff, what's your take on whether the honeymoon is over?
I disagree with Andy. There hasn't been a honeymoon, so it's not even got started to get over. Rachel Reeves set the stall out with her very sober analysis and our play on Keynes. If we can't afford it, we can't do it. And I think that set in motion the context in which we've seen the discourse continue throughout. I am really baffled at handling. Now, this all strikes me as a government that hasn't been in government for 14 years. There's a little bit of naivety about here. All this expensive stuff comes and goes. It can get a bit boring for some of us who've been around the political knockabout for some time, but the way you answer some of this stuff and try and draw a line under it, there's clearly not a consistent message bank there that people are drawing upon, because we're getting different answers from different Labour ministers or politicians throughout the conference. Some are being pretty bullish and saying, no, it's fine, it was great to have a wee treat with Taylor Swift, and others are saying, well, actually, we may have to look at this again, and trying to explain it in some sort of context. And then you've got Keir Starmer sort of saying, well, I think some people that look at me taking a £9,000 box at Arsenal every week and saying, well, I think that's fair dues. I don't think people are saying fair dues, Keir. You know, understand if it's about security, stick to the security line and shut up, say nothing else. So there's clearly a lack of message discipline about this stuff, and it's all kind of played into this wider malaise. And you're quite right, it's been reflected in the polls, but we're Holyrood Sources, and we're thinking about what this means for Scotland as well, particularly. And I saw Anna Sarwar put out a tweet recently. He was with a candidate, I can't remember exactly where, and his whole thing was talking about it's time for change, and he's playing on what was so successful in the UK election campaign for UK Labour. And I thought, that's not going to cut this. The only way that works is if the people associate the change that Labour are enacting at Westminster as being positive. If it's not, you're going to have to nuance that message pretty carefully and pretty soon if you're going to be successful in 2026. This is not the start the Labour Party wanted, and it's certainly not the start that Anna Sarwar wanted either. And I think he must be a wee bit head in his hands, particularly over the winter fuel payments. That's a real problem for him. And I saw Jackie...
Sorry, Geoff.
Carry on.
No, on you go.
No. It's your show.
Winter fuel payments, right? As with child benefit cap, the two-child cap, winter fuel payments, let's not mix these two things up. They're not unpopular. The public supports mean testing of winter fuel payments. The public supports the two-child cap.
Not if the sample size is pensioners.
Well, sure, but the sample size isn't pensioners. Right? I mean,
So what happens?
Part of the reason we're in this trouble, I'm afraid, is that politicians of both colours over the years have pandered to pensioners because they vote. Right? There's a lot of intergenerational unfairness here, and that's what both parties have been doing because they vote. The population is very clearly before all the other freebie stuff happened. It's very clear from polling the population supports means testing of winter fuel payments. So it wasn't even close. So that's not why they're in trouble.
Fine. Let's bring Kezia in on this, if we may, because Kezia, as Geoff points out, we do like to focus on what this means for Scotland. Worth noting that Anna Sarwar and the Scotland Secretary Ian Murray also took free tickets. They went to a Liverpool match last weekend, as reported in the Daily Record. Scottish Secretary Ian Murray on the Sunday show on the BBC at the weekend. This happens all the time in politics. Is Labour at risk of losing Scotland already?
No, look, this whole story to do with tickets for gigs and football matches is suboptimal. I'll give you that. It's a phrase that the kids use, so to speak, but it's not a scandal, right? It's just not a scandal. There's no suggestion that rules have been broken. these things have been reported, there's a degree of transparency. In fact, it's because there's a degree of transparency, we all know exactly what football games they've been going to and who's been paying for it. That said, it's not the backdrop I'm sure the party would have wanted going into this conference, and there's a lot riding on Keir Starmer's speech this afternoon. Yes, that balance between tone, so things are serious, things are hard, but it can get better, emphasis on the latter half of that sentence, but also I think he probably needs a couple of tangible, juicy announcements to give people something to hold on to in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and we'll keep.
Can I just come in? Can I just come in that, Calum, because Andrew cut me off. Kez has just made the exact point. It's not so much the issue itself about tickets and all the rest of it. It's the way that they've been handled by various politicians and the response that they've all been given. And it's the juxtaposition against the winter fuel payments is the point I'm making, Andy. So it makes it an easy story for political journalists and hacks to go after and say you're benefiting, but you're about to cut their benefits. It's quite something. And that's the point true. I was trying to make. Yep. That's the point I was trying to make.
I'm totally with you.
Look. At the end of the day, I don't think there has been a honeymoon. To answer your question, Calum, can they resuscitate? Yes, there's plenty time for the UK parliamentary term to regain the ground. But my point is more about for Anas Sarwar. This is the last thing he wanted, because he wants to be riding the coattails of a successful, positive Labour Party going into 2026. It's not looking like that just now. Plenty of time to change that, of course. But he might have to think about his messaging ahead of the parliamentary elections in Holyrood.
Well, that's a good point, because here's polling reported in the Times from a week ago on the 17th of September, which has, by extrapolation from Professor Sir John Curtis, the SNP on 47 at Holyrood, the Scottish Greens on 9, Labour on 33, the Conservatives and Reform UK each on 16 seats, and the Lib Dems on 8. Stephen, what's your analysis of that? Because, Labour's demise, without wishing to over-dramatise it, but this polling suggests that the SNP might be in with a bit of a shout.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, Andy, saying the next election's in 5 years' time, because, of course, there's a Scottish election in 18 months' time. And if the horizon is 18 months, I think it's going to be a challenge for the Labour Party to deliver the sort of uplift that they're probably hoping to have in time for a UK election in 5 years' time. So the question is, does the Westminster Labour government become an asset for the Labour campaign in Scotland, or does it become a drag? And I think the risk is that it's a drag on Labour in Scotland. So for us who are interested in the Scottish election, I think it makes it all the more exciting. The SNP are absolutely in with a shout, and Anas Sarwar is looking over his shoulder to see what next comes out of his government in London.
Go on, Andy.
So I think this can actually be a good thing for Anas Sarwar. There was always a risk for me after July the 4th that Scottish Labour would think that they could effectively do in Scotland to the SNP what they did at Westminster to the Tories, which is just not be them. And that is then enough to win an election, because that's how they won the election at Westminster. We've discussed on this podcast before, and I didn't ever think it was enough for Labour in Scotland just to not be the SNP. The SNP are not unpopular enough yet for that to be the case. And if this actually focuses on Anas Sarwar's mind, and if he now says to himself, actually, I can't just rely on there being a Labour government at Westminster to then win at Holyrood. I need to do more. I need to come up with something myself to make this better. Then I think it's a good thing for him. And I think the other thing that we're potentially seeing, which again is something that Anas Sarwar needs to understand, is that Swinney and Forbes is a different proposition to Yousaf and Harvey. And I think we're very quietly, without any fanfare, I think people out there, the sort of people who get polled, the sort of people who vote, are just very quietly calmer than they were this time 6 months ago. And I think it's coming through in the polling. John and Kate Forbes haven't really done anything yet, but that's the point. They haven't made mistakes. They haven't caused problems. They may not have done anything groundbreaking, but just their very presence, I think, is calming people down, and it's giving Labour a problem in the polls.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, though, the SNP can't sit there and go, okay, we're back in the game. We don't have to do anything, Andy. They need to address a lot of deficiencies in the government just now. I think they recognise what those deficiencies are, and they need to be bold. You're right, we haven't seen the real makings of what the Swinney-Forbes partnership means. But clearly we need to see something more, because people will start asking, okay, we're willing to give you another crack at this, but what are you offering? And we're not quite seeing that. We're seeing a lot of hedging in some of the policies just now. A great example being the private rented sector stuff. We thought it was kind of intimated through different commentators that might be ended, but it wasn't. I think this is the time to be bold in some of this stuff and to really take on Labour in the centre ground. But we'll see if that materialises or not.
Yeah, really interesting. And Kezia and Stephen, thank you both for your thoughts on all of that as well. The reason that Kezia and Stephen are here is because here in 2024 we are marking, of course, 10 years since the independence referendum. As you've heard on this podcast over the course of the last over the last few months, we're also marking 25 years of devolution. And I suppose with all of that in mind, there is much conversation about what is the way forward with these issues in mind, with how the Scottish Parliament functions, with how the Scottish Government functions, and I suppose with the tone of the conversation in Scotland right now. What can be done to progress and to make Scotland better, to improve things? I think, Kezia, I'm not misrepresenting that is the thrust of what you and Stephen are getting at today, with consideration of independence and devolution and fiscal framework and all of these things. Outline for us the work that you've done. What is the kind of central proposition from you both?
So that's the sales pitch, Calum. Stephen and I both work at the Centre for Public Policy based at the University of Glasgow, and it's our job to think big about Scotland's future and all the public policy challenges that come with that. So we decided, somebody from yes, somebody from no, that it was worth us sitting down and having a new conversation about the Constitution, starting with our shared values and starting with the things that we agree on. So we've written a paper together. We think it's quite chunky. We think it's full of good ideas, called Scotland in the Constitution, Agreeing a Way Forward. We agree on everything in this paper. The question is, what do you think?
Well, yeah, and we're going to unpack some of that over the course of the next little while. Stephen, it might shock our listeners to hear that you and Kezia agree on anything. Can you just explain what that means?
And I should also say Andy was the one who introduced Kez and me, so he's the grandfather of this paper.
Listen, I get in enough trouble on this podcast, right? Come on.
So, I mean, we've been working at the Centre for Public Policy together for, several months now, and it's just become obvious that there is a significant overlap in our attitude towards a range of different public policy issues. We disagree on the end route. I'm pro-independence, Kez is pro-the UK. But apart from that difference, there's a lot that actually we agree on in the middle. And part of what we're trying to say is that maybe it's time for us to approach the constitutional debate from a policy perspective first. So rather than seeing policy through the frame of the Constitution, seeing the Constitution through the frame of policy and working out, well, what are the powers we need? What are the government structures we need? What are the relationships we need in order to tackle child poverty or in order to grow the economy, etc., etc. So that's a starting point. Let's begin on the ground that unites us and then try and move forward.
So just on that, Calum, sorry, before we get into the meat of it, I think just one thing to say on that, which is quite important, is that it might be unusual in the world of politics for somebody like Kez and Stephen to come together, but it's not unusual in the world of people, right? Most politicians live in a world of black or a world of white, but people live in a world of grey. So these two coming together to find common ground on arguably the biggest problem that we have in the country is abnormal for politicians, but totally normal for people. And I do think that's important context.
Although I would add to that,
totally normal.
Verging on it, I think, is maybe what he's getting at. What I would say, though, is to add to that, is actually that was one of the big things that came out of our 25 years of devolution special, was that people were quite taken aback, almost, at the range of politicians that could sit on stage and reminisce about a time where they worked together, certainly coming at it from different backgrounds and perhaps, different final destinations or whatever, but their commonality was what is going to make Scotland a better place. And I think that was quite striking back in March. And Kezia, it seems like that's kind of what you're building on here. I also note in your paper that you suggest we're entering a new period of Scottish politics. Do you mean a Labour-led Scottish government?
Well, that's obviously what I want, Calum, but that's got no relevance to this paper, right?
Interesting.
What we're
That's
trying
interesting,
to say
yeah.
is that last 10 years, that decade of division, as so many people in the Labour Party would like to describe it, is over. But a new chapter is beginning and a new conversation needs to start with it. And we're suggesting that conversation should start with, where do we agree? What are our common values? What's the type of Scotland we want to build? And where do the powers need to sit in order to deliver that? So this paper for me really breaks down into 4 broad ideas. It looks at further devolution and offers a process for how we could have a ground-up swell of what further powers could look like. It looks at codifying the route to a second independence referendum. It answers the question, if this union is voluntary, how do you leave it? I think that's important because it allows us, I think, to move away from process questions about independence to independence itself, if that's the question that people want to return to. Crucially for me, it also addresses really current, live, topical things that are happening right now, like the constraints that the fiscal framework poses. We've literally seen the Cabinet Secretary for Finance have to stop spending because she's got so little flexibility with the fiscal powers available to her. Now, yes, I can hear Labour people already in my ear saying that's because she overpromised on pay, and there are lots of caveats to that. But it is still the case that 25 years into the devolution project, we don't have the fiscal mechanisms of a mature Parliament. The Parliament can underspend, it can't overspend. It's very difficult to do 3-year pay deals, yada yada, onwards we go. And the final 4th big chunky idea in here, Calum, is this idea of really making the no detriment principle from the Smith Commission real, something that lives and breathes. And we've got an example in this paper around how you could make that work in housing policy. I'm obsessed with housing policy. I want Scotland to build a whole new generation of social homes, but I know that budget for capital spend is really restricted. And I think if the Scottish Government does something that saves the UK Treasury money, like build housing, so it reduces housing benefit bill, it should be able to keep that, or at least keep some of it and spend that money again. So there's just 4 big broad ideas in this paper that explain why we're trying to chart a new story.
Are you okay, Geoff? Sorry, you're signalling at me. You all right?
Yeah, back now, sorry.
Yeah, fine. Kezia, just before we kind of dive in a bit deeper, we should probably explain what the no detriment principle of the Smith Commission is.
Stephen, come on. You've been researching this. You're going to be able to give the perfect answer.
So if a policy implemented by the Scottish Government has a cost on the UK Government, the Scottish Government would then cover that cost. And I suppose what we're suggesting is that if the Scottish Government introduces a policy that has a saving for the UK Government, the Scottish Government should benefit from that saving. So it's recognising that the 2 administrations have an impact on each other and trying to level out both the positive and negative side of that impact.
Understood.
Is that
okay? Before. Yeah, perfect. Absolutely spot on. Just before we bring in Geoff and Andy and we sort of do the analysis bit, I think we should just explain a bit more of the detail on the kind of 4 big ideas and what we're guessing at within them as well, just for those who may not have read the paper as they're listening to this. So first of all, on further devolution, and I guess the kind of process for doing that, Stephen, what is the proposition on further powers?
I suppose what we're saying is that the 2016 Scotland Act, the settlement we currently are living under, is perhaps the only concrete outcome of the referendum. So 10 years on, it's an appropriate time to reflect on it, especially given we've had Brexit, given what we've come to learn about the fiscal framework, the way the budget operates, given the experience of a really severe financial shock with inflation, the energy crisis, a severe societal shock with COVID. These are all things which tell us something about how the settlement works. So what we're suggesting is a process, modelled on a process that the Labour government in Wales established, which would look at 3 aspects of the devolution settlement: Brexit impact, the boundaries between devolved and reserved competencies, and goodness, I've forgotten the final one. Remind me, Kez. Brexit.
How the fiscal arrangements work in practice.
Fiscal arrangements, yes, there you go.
So just give me a run at that one again, Stephen, and I'll edit that together. And just say, and the third one is, and do that.
And the third one is the fiscal arrangements, how the fiscal framework, the budget actually works in reality.
Okay, so that's on devolution. So it's kind of re-examining 2016, which you say in the paper brought new powers and tax and social security, but brought complexity as well. Is part of this, Kezia, about simplifying the situation for the Scottish Parliament? Are we saying that the Scottish Parliament can't handle the complexity of what it currently has in its power?
No, I don't think that's right. It's not about anybody being able to handle anything. It's about asking whether it's doing the job we asked it to do, which is to allow us to deliver better public policy for people that live in Scotland, and ask those hard questions when we think about the deep-rooted challenges and opportunities that Scotland faces. How are those current powers working? And if they're not working well, how can we fix that?
Okay. Andy, what do you make of that? Is it time to re-examine those 2016 powers, which Stephen suggests is the kind of only tangible, policy outcome, I suppose, from the independence referendum itself?
Yeah, I do. I think it's, as we've discussed throughout the year, I think it's time to re-examine quite a lot of things, not only the powers, but also the way the Parliament works. But I think the most important thing that comes from this, re-examination of the powers is really important. And I think we need to do that, particularly on borrowing, which is mentioned in Stephen and Kez's paper as well, because I think that the lack of borrowing powers is really holding us back, particularly in terms of fixing our infrastructure, which is pretty hopeless. But the most important thing for me to come from the paper is the codification of how we get to another independence referendum, if we do get to another independence referendum. And that sounds, so on the face of it, that sounds like something that nationalists would want. That's what it sounds like. You immediately think, oh, a process for Indie Ref 2, that's a nationalist thing. So as somebody who voted no, and as somebody who would vote no again today, I don't think that is a nationalist thing. I think it's a Scottish thing. I think all of us, nationalist or unionist, or as I would classify myself, to be honest, a federalist or a something in between it, or whatever you want to call me, I think we will all benefit from there being a process in place that tells us how this happens. I think Canada's benefited from that. I think Northern Ireland, different situation, but I think Northern Ireland has benefited from that as well. And the reason I think we can benefit from it is that in the last 10 years, what have we done? I mean, as a country, what have we actually done? Nothing. Really nothing. No. We have not made this country better in the last 10 years. This country is worse in almost every way in the last than it was 10 years ago. Education is worse. Infrastructure is worse. The economy is worse. The NHS is worse. We're worse because we don't have our eye on the ball. Because everything that we try to do, we have something in the back of our heads, whether nationalists or unionists, saying, what does that do to the constitutional argument? Does that put votes in the yes box or does that put votes in the no box? And we do nothing as a result of that because we're too scared to lose votes for one side or for the other. So the most important thing this thing does is it puts it in a box and it says, this is how you achieve it, but at the moment, let's not even think about it. And that's really critical for the country going forward that we do that. And it's, for me, is the most important thing that comes from this. And I think every leader of nationalist parties and unionist parties should look at this and say, we can get on board with that and we know we need to do it.
Well, that neatly brings us on to your propositions in this area then, the route to an independence referendum. So, Kezia, just explain for us. Andy mentions Northern Ireland, and actually that is an example that you cite as well, as to how a unification referendum in Northern Ireland would be triggered, and that's something of a template for what you're proposing.
So I think it's really important, just as Andy has said, that people read this paper, because if you take a 30-second summary of it, a lot of people are going to jump to very quick judgments about what they think about it. And the detail here matters, and there's lots of detail in this paper about the Quebec experience in Canada, about Catalonia, and indeed about Northern Ireland. And it looks at the values that underpins the positions in all those respective countries and all the respective processes they've gone through. So when you look at Catalan and Quebec, the examples there are all about balancing competing rights and interests between their equivalents of yes and no, right? That's what their whole processes are designed to address. And then when you look at Northern Ireland, and in particular the Good Friday Agreement and the values that it underpins, it's about clarity, inclusivity, informed choice, procedural legitimacy and stability. Find me a person in the country that doesn't want all of those 5 things for Scotland's constitutional question, right? So we've taken all of these values and gone, what can you take from this and apply to the situation we find ourselves in Scotland today, and also think about all the challenges Scotland will have to anticipate in the future. And we've settled on the proposition that we should follow what the Good Friday Agreement says about a unification process in the island of Ireland, and that is that we would place a duty, a responsibility, a legal mandate on the Secretary of State for Scotland to determine when a second independence referendum would take place. Now that's not on their political whim, it's not on their political party position, it's based on a reading they have to make of where public opinion is at any given time. And if that public opinion is sustained and in support of independence, not a referendum, sustained support for independence, then they must move to a position of a Section 30 order, giving the Scottish Parliament the power at that point to determine how that referendum would run.
Okay.
Stephen, have I captured the essence of what we're trying to say together here?
Yeah, very well.
Good. Geoff, do you want to respond to that then? So, by way of what Kezia and Stephen outlined here, it's about the Secretary of State for Scotland monitoring the situation, basically, and if it feels like there's, or it can be demonstrated that there is a public attitude in support of independence, that's the time to push the button.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I thought Andy said that it's not a unionist thing, it's not a nationalist thing, it's a Scottish thing. It's a democratic thing. It's an underlying democratic principle. I mean, and you know, this paper makes an important contribution at the right time, because you've seen some unionist politicians now that the once in the generation is no longer as valid because we're almost a generation over, then being asked questions about how do you get to independence then? What are the circumstances? And they're struggling on it. I suppose my question is this, right? Twofold. Firstly, should the SNP win the next election with a majority or with another party that has the same exact wording in its manifesto around a next independence referendum, is that the point at which Ian Murray, Secretary of State, would have to say, under your proposals, well, yes, you can have another referendum, here's the powers to hold it? Because that's what you're going to be asked about, and this will have to be teased out, I suspect, pretty short order. I suppose my second point is, just to that point, what are you guys going to do with this paper? So it's a very interesting, well thought out paper across all the 4 disciplines that Kezia mentioned. But how are you going to make it work? How is it not just going to sit on a shelf? Are you now going to speak to the political parties? Are you going to try and convene some sort of constitutional commission, or indeed potentially a convention at a later stage to try and embed this and get agreement from it? Because this is all for nothing if we don't get some sort of agreement, surely.
Okay, so first of all, is it all about an SNP win at Holyrood, Stephen?
No, so it's precisely not that. I mean, what we say is that the test becomes whether the people of Scotland want Scotland to be independent. And if you're able to demonstrate that over a period of time, that's the point at which you then have an independence referendum. So
is that in opinion polling, for example, Stephen?
But how do you demonstrate it then, Stephen? No, seriously, how do you demonstrate it?
Demonstrated. In the Northern Ireland example, there's been a recent court case which we talk about in the paper, which gives some indication of the sorts of considerations you're talking about. So the Secretary of State would have a legal duty to honestly assess the case for majority support for independence, and would do it across a range of measures, from election results to opinion surveys, including ones that they could themselves commission, to votes in Parliament, to a range of other qualitative and quantitative measures. So this is part of what the discussion would have to be. What exactly is that basket going to look like? But I suppose where we're coming from is that if you think back to 1997 and the devolution referendum, we all knew that this is what people wanted. And we knew it from a range of different measures, from opinion polls, election results, campaigns, etc., etc. We had the vote, but we knew devolution was going to win. So what we're saying is roughly analogous to this. At the point at which we are confident that independence is going to win, that's the point at which the referendum should be held. The phrase is settled will. I think that's a phrase that's sometimes misused or overused, but it's not about a particular party winning one particular election. And I'll maybe just add one thing. So I remember back to 2014 and the immediate aftermath of the referendum, and one of the conversations that we had on our side was how would we win? And the sense was that all we needed to do was to get another referendum, and then through a campaign in the same way, we'd be able to nip up above 50%, and that would be enough. I don't think that's enough, because I think that as well as winning the campaign, you've got to do a process that unites the nation. And so just nipping above 50% after a hard-fought campaign doesn't give us the unity, the sense of national purpose that would come when you actually have a solid, sustained majority support for independence.
Right, okay, can I just tease this out though, because this is pretty important if you're gonna get the SNP back in here, right? So let's just understand, what is your proposal, if we accept everything you've said, for the SNP's campaign at the next 2026 elections? Are they saying vote for us to have another referendum, or vote SNP for independence? But actually it won't be, because we've codified this in the noon Dugdale paper. It says we have to demonstrate it through other ways of public support. You see where I'm going with this, you know, and this is where you might fall into some difficulty. And I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah. So my advice to the SNP,
as we used to do all those years ago.
Yeah, my approach to the next election would be for the SNP to say, let's get Scotland back in the EU. Let's set ourselves a national target, 10 years' time, to be members of the EU once again. And we are willing to do that via independence. We're willing to do it if the UK is up for it as well. We'll follow whatever path we can to get back into the EU, get that crucial membership of the EU. And we make that the target, and then we build support for that proposition, and you know, the referendum follows when you've got the support. So for me, the starting point is the level of support. It's not the process. It's if people want it, people should get it.
Can I come in on that? This is not something that anybody's going to adopt tomorrow. Well, actually, somebody might. Yeah. I'll come back on that in a wee second. So if you break it down, the difficulty with this sort of approach, as I said before about the black, the white and the grey, the difficulty with this sort of approach is that the experience over the last 15 years of constitutional ebb and flow means that somebody's always got the upper hand. And if you've got the upper hand, you don't give any ground. That's what we've seen before. So after 2015, when the SNP were on the ascendancy, they wouldn't give any ground whatsoever, right? It was independence or nothing. There'd be no process. Whatever the process was, give us a referendum right now, we want it, right? Now that Labour look like they've got a bit of the upper hand, it's difficult for them to say, why would we give ground now? We're winning now. They're losing. That's why they want us to. So there's never really an incentive for either side to give ground yet. But look at all the polling for 2026. It's pretty tight. It's pretty tight. Everything that we're seeing at the moment would suggest that the SNP and Labour will get roughly numbers of seats a bit more similar to what happened in 2007, where nobody's massively powerful at the expense of somebody else. And it's at that sort of moment where I would hope that they might say, okay, we both have a reason to compromise. We both have a reason to say, okay, let's think about something different. Forget the Tories. This is a hill the Tories will die on, right? So forget that. That's not going to happen. The Lib Dems, and I'm looking at Geoff. I'm actually not going to look at Geoff because he already thinks I'm a member of the Lib Dems anyway. The Lib Dems could take this on right now, and I think they should, because I think this is a really good point for them. This is exactly the territory that they should be in, and I think they should take this now. But ultimately, it does need to be adopted by Labour and the SNP. And I think that in order to adopt it, neither of them needs to feel like they have a massive advantage over the other one, or they won't have the incentive to do anything.
So I don't expect either party or any party to adopt this tomorrow. What I'm asking is that they don't kill it tomorrow either, right? That they let it breathe, they think about it, they ask themselves, if not this, what? Right? Because when we think about, for example, a route to a second independence referendum, the Supreme Court tells us that cannot be done in the Scottish Parliament. End of. New chapter, new story required, right? And I know there'll be people in the SNP who will read this, see the bit about the Secretary of State for Scotland and come to the conclusion that this is some sort of governor's charter, that they won't wait for a Secretary of State to tell them when they can have an independence referendum. That's not what this is. It's about mandating that government minister to read the mood of the nation and to move to a referendum at that point. Equally, there's going to be stuff in this that Labour will hate, and they'll hate me for advocating it. I've got very little doubt in my mind about that. But a Labour government, or a Labour party that wants to be in government in 2026, might want to start caring about how the fiscal framework actually works in practice. faced with all the challenges that we know that we have in the NHS, for example, and the desperate need that we have to move to a model of preventative spend and public service reform, we know all of that takes money, and money that doesn't exist. So maybe the Labour Party would quite like the idea that it could have, a 5-year spending plan within the Scottish Government's kind of fiscal framework, that it could have more flexibility about how much it can overspend by. It will have the ability to craft multi-year pay deals and do all the things that the SNP have long wanted to do. Equally, I'm sure there isn't a great appetite for people to go immediately into another conversation about more powers for the Parliament, but that's not the starting point. The starting point for me in this whole paper has been to go, what will it actually take to end child poverty? What are the powers we need? Where do they sit? And how do we get the money to do this? This whole paper starts with those public policy challenges and shakes out the powers questions as a secondary element of that, and that's what makes it so different.
So how do you ensure that it's not killed, though, Kez? Because, you've rightly pointed out where some of your, likely critics and criticisms may come from. So returning to my question, what is the next steps that you guys are going to take in terms of activating this, in terms of engaging with political parties and broader Civic Scotland so that it isn't killed?
So you guys are doing a big part of that, right? Because you're giving us a hearing and an airing, and you're asking the hard questions that need to be asked of this paper. We have had a little bit of a process of going around some key people in political parties and going, look, this is what we think. They have provided us with feedback. Not every bit of feedback has been positive, and not every bit of feedback is reflected in this paper. But that is the start of this conversation, right? And when we come off this call today, I'll be spending the next 24 hours, the next goodness knows how long, emailing this paper out to people who I know will have opinions about it, asking them to consider specific sections, to think about how they could play a role in developing this conversation. It's a new conversation. It's very different from the arguments of the past. It's asking people to start around common values and shared ground.
How does this proposition accommodate the fact that people change their minds? And I think I mean that both pre a potential referendum and post a potential independence referendum. So we only have to think back to the campaign of, in the build-up to 2014. But in the first 3 months after the official referendum campaign period started, the prognosis for yes was actually pretty poor, kind of between 30 and 40%. And obviously we know what the final result was, 55-45 no. And we know that there was a tipping point in an opinion poll, Geoff likes to remind us of this a lot, just immediately before the independence referendum, where actually yes were ahead. So even during that time, people changed their mind in a way that they hadn't been forced to in the kind of interim between 1999 and 2014. They didn't have to contend with the issue of independence, and suddenly when it was on the table in an official campaign, they did. And so they changed their minds. So one, how does the Secretary of State accommodate for that a campaign can change people's minds? And two, what happens if 5 years post-independence, people have changed their minds and suddenly there's a sustained feeling in opinion polling or in election results or whatever that independence is a bad thing and that actually Scotland should be part of the UK again?
So in Northern Ireland there's been a fair bit of academic work addressing these sorts of questions, and one of the reasons why the threshold for triggering a referendum is not just 50% but higher than 50% is exactly for that reason. The possibility that support for the proposition would come down over the course of the campaign. Of course, it could also go up. So I suppose what I would say is that if over a period of 12 to 16 months you had support for independence at, say, on average 53%, and it had peaked at 58% and it had a low level of 48%, and that sort of variation, you'd probably say that's not consistent, stable support for independence. But if, say, independence had never, over that same 12 to 16 month period, independence had never fallen below 55% in support, but had often reached up to 58, 57%, whatever it might be, you'd be saying to yourself, yeah, probably we're beginning to get into the space where there's a stable and clear majority support for independence. Now, I'm offering those numbers as an illustration rather than as a suggestion of what they should be. But I think what I'm trying to do is show you that when we see it, we'll know it. There's a difference between fluctuating, unstable support for a proposition and constant, clear support for the proposition. And once that settled will, in inverted commas, is there, the mechanism would be triggered.
Interesting. Really interesting. Okay. Kezia, shall we chat a bit more about, I suppose, some of the other issues that you present in the paper, so around the fiscal framework, that you've mentioned that a little over the course of our conversation today. Is this part, then, of the wider conversation on further powers? And I do wonder if it actually feeds into the independence question. There's an argument, isn't there, that the more powers you get as a devolved parliament, well, you're kind of on the way to independence anyway. So, how does that work?
So it doesn't have to be about more powers, right? That we're not saying that is the end goal. It can also be about how existing powers work. So we're more than 5 years beyond the point of the Smith Commission powers coming into reality. We've had a very kind of structural review, formal review by the Scottish Government of how they're working and what the different metrics they use to do that are, but nobody's really kicked the tyres and gone, is this what we hoped would happen when the Parliament raised half of its own taxes? Does it deliver the maturity and the flexibility that a 25-year-old Parliament should have? And the answer for me is no. And I've given you the example of the emergency protocols coming into effect. I'd like to think we could have a system that allowed the Scottish Parliament more than 12 months to have a hard stop on how it plans its budget. I'll give you a really good example of where I think this goes wildly wrong, right? We're expecting a UK budget from the Chancellor in October. We also know the exact date, barely 3 months later, over Christmas, that the Scottish Government has to set its budget. That is a ridiculous way to plan how the Scottish Government will spend its money, because it spends so long waiting to find out how much it's going to have. That said, the block grant adjustments that come from those Smith Commission powers can take 3 years to trickle through. So, for example, this year, the financial year ahead, 25-26, is based on income tax revenues from 2023 and estimates made about what they are. So how can it be right that we spend 3 months, just 3 months, translating a UK government into a Scottish government total, but it can take 3 years for the money to trickle back? That doesn't help us plan. That doesn't help us do preventative public spending. It doesn't help us reform the NHS. It doesn't help us tackle what we need to do, for example, to deliver a national care service. Anyone that cares about devolution, anyone that's serious about being in power in the Scottish Government should care about this stuff. And this is an opportunity to fix it, and these are ideas about how you can and should fix it.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's the starting point. If we can argue for independence, we can argue for the union and still agree to work on ironing out the obvious problems in the settlement as we have it. And we have spent too long focusing on the arguments at the edge, but there's a whole middle ground where there is a huge degree of overlap. And I agree with Kez. I think any party that's serious about becoming government in Scotland has to be also serious about making the settlement work in the most effective way. And that's our bottom line. Is this working as well as we would hope? I mean, Brexit's the other big one. I mean, we've seen various changes brought in because of Brexit, which are really complex and chunky and problematic. We've seen that over the past few years. So let's sit down and work out why is this happening and what changes can be made so that the Scottish Parliament is able to legislate in the way that we voted for back 25 years ago was expected. 25 years ago, the ability to have Scottish solutions for Scottish problems.
Kezia,
if I may just, Calum, just very quickly, I just want to come on. Kezia brilliantly outlined some of the fallacies around the finances of our country. I mean, I was nodding along to what she was saying, because it is quite ridiculous the way this works. And we've had the Barnett formula, and we've had a portion of the additional tax rates that we set since then, and it really is quite confusing. Other than full fiscal autonomy, remember that phrase, Stephen, from our day? It's very difficult to see how you square that circle, in all honesty. And I wonder if there is room for more discourse in this particular area, how we can get a better financial model. I'm sure there are other ways, but certainly for me, obviously, I would vouch for the full fiscal arrangements. But there is an element of how we address that, because the economics is intrinsically linked to the politics here. Always has been, always will be. and I just don't think that the system as is fit for purpose.
Kezia, I just want to put to you as a kind of concluding thought that perhaps one of the biggest lessons in this conversation, in this paper, is the fact that you both actually describe yourselves as being historically opponents. And here you are sitting together, starting this conversation, and we're very grateful to be starting it on the podcast with you today. And actually, I feel like this year has been a demonstration of that around the devolution referendum and what we talked about at the start during our devolution special, that feeling that these people who are diametrically opposed on where they eventually want to get to, but right here, right now, consider what they can do together to advance the cause of Scotland, I think is interesting. I think there, even on this podcast in the past, we've discussed a caucus for the Highlands and Islands representation. And I actually think there is just this appetite for people to work better together. That was accidental, stumbled into that one, but you take my point. And perhaps that is actually one of the crucial lessons here in all of this, is that the politicians who are listening to this right now and who are reading your paper as a result and who want to consider this, that they need to kind of, I'll say it perhaps more bluntly than you will, grow up and work together.
So look, we are both academics. This is a paper rooted in research and evidence, with a flavour of our own opinions and arguments and ideas about the future written through it. That's what makes it different, that's what makes it refreshing. It's chunky at 50 pages. What it starts with, though, is our stories, our own personal stories about why we believe what we believe, how we reflect on the referendum 10 years ago, what our roles in that were, what we've learned about ourselves, about our country since then, and actually what we've learned about the people that we did consider opponents. Maybe even stronger words than that 10 years ago, right? Stephen and I didn't know each other in the referendum. We were diametrically opposed, literally across the two major TV debates between Alistair Darling and Alex Salmond. We were literally in the teams of people on either side of that debate. And here we are now 10 years on, starting with where we agree. Isn't that what Scotland wants? Isn't that the conversation this country needs?
Really, really interesting. Geoff and Andy, a final thought from each of you. I think, Geoff, first of all, in terms of what this means for the SNP, I'm going to actually match this with a comment from Alex Massey, columnist in The Times, co-host of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, of course. And Alex says, the faithful, referring to SNP faithful, must hear that the push for independence is relentless, but those less convinced it is the only solution to every difficulty are to be reassured that the government now has other things in its mind. Now, he's looking at that through the lens of the Swinney-Forbes government and the direction of travel of them as First Minister and Deputy First Minister and what that means. But I thought that comment actually is pertinent in the context of this paper, because the SNP, if it were to adopt the suggestions from Stephen and Kezia, would have to evaluate what that means for its messaging to the party.
Yeah, and that kind of reflects my comments earlier on when I was trying to challenge kind of Stephen on, okay, so what does this mean in practical terms when you come to an election where there will be a demand from certain quarters of the Yes movement that the SNP put this front and centre, and that's going to be a real challenge. So there is a lot of work to be done if this body of work is to progress, in all honesty. I hope it does progress, not because I agree with every word in it, I don't, but because of what Kezia just said. I mean, we need to have a much more grown-up conversation about the future of our country. We can't maintain this deadlock forever, and that's going to have to take compromise from all of the political parties, and not just one or two, all of them. I just perhaps fear that when we get into the cut and thrust of an election campaign, that willingness to compromise peters away. But we will see. Well done in bringing it to the table, guys.
Well, this is it, and this, as they say, this is the start of a conversation. Andy, you've already, advocated once again for your party, the Liberal Democrats, and
will you all stop this? I'm in so much bother.
And spoken of the irrelevance, once again, of the Scottish Conservatives. So perhaps I should ask you about Scottish Labour and what it would mean for them. Is there something of a... If we consider that kind of SNP support has drifted back to Labour and might drift again and has drifted historically back and forth, is there actually something here for Anas Sarwar to latch onto and to delicately talk about in a kind of more affectionate way than perhaps historically you might have done?
Well, at the election in July, the SNP went from 45% to 30%. The Tories went from 25% to 12.5%. And all of those voters, nationalist voters and unionist voters, they all went to Labour. So by definition, Labour have got a very wide range of constitutional views in their voter base now. So I think Anas Sarwar absolutely could and should serve those views by taking a more nuanced position on the Constitution. I don't think he will, I'm going to be honest. I don't think he's going to at this point. But I do think he should, and I think he could do very well with that. I think there's more chance of doing it after the election than before, but nonetheless, I think he should. Look, I'm really tired, to be honest. I'm tired of failure. I want Scotland to do really well, and I find it humiliating when you go to Ireland and look at their road networks, or you go to Scandinavia and look at their education system, or you go to Central Europe and look at the way they do their healthcare and pension system. I find it embarrassing. I find it concerning because, I've got kids growing up in this country and I would like it to do well, and I don't think we can do well on the big things we need to change while this is hanging over our heads. Everybody will have a different view on the outcome, and everybody will have a different view on Kez and Stephen's paper. But what else is there? I don't see anybody putting forward any other solutions other than vote for us and we'll give you what you want. And that's not working. So I would say, well done to Kez and Stephen for putting this together. Is it the end point? Who knows? Maybe it is. I think it's pretty solid. I don't think there's that much needs done to it to make it work. But at least let's engage in the conversation. And leaders of the political parties, we know they listen to this podcast. We have surveyed them, Calum, as you know. They listen to the podcast. Indeed. Read the paper, think about it, grow up, and give us some ideas.
There we go. Kezia and Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you for bringing this conversation to our podcast first as well. We really, really appreciate that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kezia Dugdale and Stephen Noon, and of course Andy Maciver and Geoff Aberdein. We can continue the conversation. You can email us hello@holyroodsources.com. Go and read the paper. There's a lot more detail in there than we've been able to sort of scratch the surface of in this conversation, but I hope it's enough to get you thinking. Is now the time for a change in the tone and approach and way forward in all of this? You can email us. We'd love to hear from you. The email address is hello@holyroodsources.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.